The Principality of Wallachia in the year 1462 existed in a state of perpetual hydraulic pressure, caught between the tectonic plates of two empires. To the north and west, the Kingdom of Hungary, a Christian bulwark under the fractious rule of Matthias Corvinus. To the south, across the natural boundary of the Danube, the Ottoman Empire, a systematized force of conquest under Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. The Wallachian voivode, Vlad III Dracula, operated not as a sovereign king, but as a vassal, his authority a precarious grant from one power or the other, perpetually contested. His capital, Târgoviște, was less a seat of royal grandeur and more a hardened forward operating base, its architecture defined by defensive walls, watchtowers, and the ever-present scent of pine resin and packed earth. The standard military doctrine of the 15th century Balkans was one of raid, skirmish, and negotiated tribute. Prisoners were assets. They were ransomed for coin, exchanged for one's own captured men, or integrated as slaves into the economic apparatus. Their value was transactional and widely understood by all parties. A prisoner was a line item in a ledger, a body with a negotiable price. The Ottoman military machine, for all its formidable discipline, operated within this shared framework of martial economics. Cruelty existed, but it was typically expedient, a tool for intimidation or extraction of information, rarely an end in itself. Vlad's campaign in the spring and early summer of 1462 deviated from this doctrine in its tactical audacity, but initially adhered to its economic logic. His infamous night attack on Mehmed's encampment was a masterpiece of asymmetric warfare. It was not a battle for territory, but a surgical strike against command structure and morale. Ottoman prisoners were taken. Standard procedure would dictate their sequestration, an inventory of their ranks and potential worth, and the opening of communications. The air in Târgoviște in the days following the attack should have been one of grim triumph, followed by the bureaucratic calm of prisoner processing. This calm did not materialize. Instead, a different order was enacted. It originated not from the martial wing of Vlad's court, but from the voivode's personal authority, bypassing the traditional councils. The prisoners were not dispersed to holding cells or put to work. They were consolidated, all of them. Soldiers, officers, auxiliaries. Their uniforms, the distinctive Ottoman Burke hats, the tunics, were not stripped for sale but left largely intact. This was the first institutional break. The prisoners were being prepared not for the market but for display. The preparation was methodical, which is the most critical detail. It was not a frenzied act of post-battle bloodlust. It was a logistical operation. Timber was requisitioned in vast quantities from the forests surrounding Târgoviște. Not cut lumber for construction, but raw, long trunks of oak and pine, their bark stripped. Workshops normally producing carts or barrels fell silent, their artisans and laborers redirected. The activity created a low hum of industry centered not on the fortress, but on the plains outside the city walls. To a distant observer, it might have resembled the preparations for a large-scale construction project, a new palisade, perhaps, or a bridge. The tools required were specific. They were not the blades of battle, swords, axes, which are designed for swift terminal work. The tools were from the domains of forestry, carpentry, and animal husbandry. Augers, adzes, heavy mallets, tar and oil, materials for preservation and weatherproofing. The procurement was documented in the castellans, records not as an armament order, but as a municipal supply request. This bureaucratic venage normalcy is the thread that begins to unravel the understanding of what followed. The institution was mobilizing its civilian infrastructure for a penal event of an as yet undefined nature. Concurrently, a separate, quieter preparation was undertaken. Vlad's personal guard, a unit distinct from the Wallachian army proper, began a process of interrogation. But its goal was not intelligence. The questions were not about troop movements, supply lines, or the Sultan's intentions. The interrogators sought biographical data, names, places of origin, length of service, names of commanders. They were compiling a roster, a registry. The act transformed the prisoners from a faceless mass into a documented collective. Their identities were being formally inscribed, just as the physical apparatus for their fate was being assembled. The Ottoman prisoners themselves existed in a state of suspended comprehension. They understood captivity. They understood the possibility of execution. But the scale of the logistical activity around them, the sheer volume of raw material, the industrial tone of the preparations, defied their experiential framework. An execution is a singular event. What was being prepared outside Târgoviște was not an event, but an installation. By the time the first rows of timber were being sharpened and treated, the purpose had become an open secret within the walls of Târgoviște. Yet no internal dissent is recorded. The boyars, the military commanders, the clergy, all institutional pillars were silent. This collective institutional silence is as significant as the act itself. It signifies a transition, a moment where the voivode's personal will became, through sheer uncompromising force, the will of the state. The system had been harnessed not for defense, not for administration, but for the material realization of a singular penal concept. The stage was set. The methodology was locked, the victims were catalogued, the institution held its breath. The process commenced at dawn. It was not conducted under the cover of darkness, which implies shame or secrecy. It was performed in the full, clear light of a summer day, transforming the act from a concealed punishment into a public institutional demonstration. The prisoners were assembled in their ranks, the registry called. This was not a hasty slaughter. It was a roll call preceding a formal procedure. Each man was made to hear his own name, his origin, announced into the still air. The bureaucratic formality was the first layer of psychological dismantling. They were not being erased as a nameless horde. They were being individually processed for a terminal public fate. The method itself, penal implantation, has been recorded across millennia and continents as a form of execution. Its horror lies in its protracted nature and its inescapable visibility. However, the common application was typically individual, or at most, applied to a small group of rebels or criminals as a stark warning at a crossroads or city gate. The system enacted at Târgoviște was of a different taxonomic order entirely. It was industrial in scale, geometric in layout, and systematic in its application of variation. The field outside Târgoviște was measured and marked. Rows were laid out not randomly, but with precise intervals, creating a grid. This was not a haphazard forest. It was a deliberately planted orchard of suffering. The variation in the preparation of the wooden stakes was itself a calculated feature of the system. Reports, later filtered through Ottoman chroniclers and diplomatic correspondence, note three primary classifications. The standard implant, a stake sharpened to a rough point, oiled to prevent immediate internal hemorrhage. This was the baseline model, designed for a slow, gravitational descent over hours or days. The blunt tip implant, a stake with a rounded, thick end. This was not an instrument of penetration, but of internal crushing and compaction, a death of organ rupture and internal bleeding, often taking longer. The angled implant, a stake set into the ground at a precise, non-vertical angle. This altered the path of internal travel, targeting specific organ clusters and prolonging consciousness through a different trajectory of trauma. The assignment of prisoner to stake type appears to have followed the registry. Officers or men from particular regiments were subjected to specific forms. This was not random cruelty. It was a codified hierarchy of suffering, a perverse mirror of the Ottoman military's own chain of command. The system implied a ledger of pain, where rank dictated the manner of one's expiration. The physical act was carried out by specialized work crews, not soldiers in the heat of passion. These crews operated with a chilling procedural efficiency. They used ropes, pulleys, and ramps, tools of construction and industry, to perform their work. The sounds were not of battle, but of labor. The grunt of men bearing weight, the creak of ropes, the solid thud of a mallet driving a stake into the hard earth. The violence was administrative, cold, and divorced from the personal enmity of the battlefield. This depersonalization was a core feature of the terror. It demonstrated that this was not an act of hate, but of policy. As the rows filled, a new logistical system emerged, maintenance and presentation. Guards were posted not to prevent rescue. The Ottoman army was in retreat, but to manage the site. Scavenging birds were driven off in the initial days to preserve the clarity of the scene. The arrangement was to be viewed in its pristine, horrifying totality. The site became a factory whose product was spectacle, and its maintenance was paramount to its function. The most profound systemic shock, however, was reserved for the primary intended witness, Sultan Mehmed II and the retreating Ottoman army. As the Ottoman forces withdrew south, their scouts and rearguard would have been the first to encounter the installation. The site itself was engineered for maximum cognitive rupture. An army that had just faced a night attack, a tactical shock, now faced a conceptual one. They did not see a battlefield. They saw a forest of the dead and dying, arranged in perfect, silent rows. They saw their own uniforms, their own comrades, transformed into components of a vast, static monument. The scale negated any possibility of a personal, emotional response of grief or rage. It induced a systemic paralysis. This was not an act of war as they understood it. It was a statement that rejected the very rules of their martial universe. The value of a prisoner, the expectation of ransom, the codes of conduct between adversarial powers, all were nullified. The silence of the site, broken only by the low sounds of the dying and the rustle of banners in the wind, was more deafening than any war cry. The Ottoman High Command, an institution built on order, precedent, and religiously framed conquest, was faced with an act that existed outside its operational lexicon. Mehmed II, the master systematizer, the architect of a bureaucratic empire, was confronted with a system of terror so complete, so methodical, that it temporarily froze the Ottoman military apparatus. The decision to retreat was not merely tactical, it was institutional. The army needed to physically and psychologically remove itself from the epistemic violence of that tableau to reassemble its own understanding of the conflict. Vlad had not just killed prisoners, he had weaponized the process of dying and displayed it as a function of state power. He had turned the human body into a standardized unit in a demonstration so vast it became a form of environmental warfare. The immediate aftermath was characterized not by chaos, but by a profound institutional silence. The Ottoman army completed its withdrawal across the Danube. Its official chronicles, instruments of state glorification, faltered. The event at Târgoviște was recorded, but in a manner that was circumspect, almost clinical. It was noted as a severe action or a fearful spectacle. The meticulous, systemic nature of the act was compressed into generalized descriptors of cruelty. This was not censorship born of shame, but of cognitive dissonance. The Ottoman historical apparatus, designed to process victory and rationalize defeat, had no protocol for documenting an event that operated on a symbolic plane outside the calculus of warfare. The silence in the records is a negative space that outlines the event's true shape. Within Wallachia, the silence was even more absolute. No internal decree celebrated the action. No church chronicle, no boyar's memoir, no victory proclamation from Vlad's chancellery mentions the specific event. It becomes a non-event in the domestic record. This erasure is the final, crucial component of the system itself. The act was designed for an external audience, the Ottoman institution. For internal consumption, it was to leave no trace in the archive, to provide no rallying cry, to found no tradition. It was a weapon fired once, whose very existence within the homeland was to be denied. This created a schism in historical memory, a foundational, horrifying fact for the enemy and a void for the perpetrator's own descendants. The site itself was subject to natural and deliberate reclamation. The stakes, untreated beyond the initial coating, would have succumbed to rot and weather. The bodies, a logistical problem on a vast scale, were likely left to the elements and carrion. There was no burial, no consecration, no marker. The field at Târgoviște was not sanctified as a monument or a memorial. It was simply allowed to return to being a field. The earth absorbed the physical evidence. The local population, instructed by terror or pragmatic silence, would have avoided the area, allowing folklore to seep into the soil where fact had occurred. Within a single growing season, the geometric horror would have been obscured by grass and wildflowers, a perfect metaphor for the historical process that followed. Vlad's own political trajectory following 1462 demonstrates the ultimate failure of his systemic terror as a long-term strategic tool. It did not secure his throne. It provided his rival, Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, with the perfect propaganda weapon. Corvinus, needing to justify his imprisonment of Vlad to both the Pope and his own nobles, seized upon the stories filtering out of the Balkans. The infamous German pamphlets of the late 15th century were born not from Wallachian boasting, but from Hungarian political necessity. They took the core, systemic truth, the methodical mass impalement, and exploded it into a carnival of unspecific pan-European gore. Vlad was transformed from a specific, calculating political actor into a generalized emblem of Eastern barbarity, a useful foil for Christendom. The system he engineered was dismantled, and its parts reassembled into myth. This transplantation from historical fact into malleable legend is the true legacy. The Forest of the Impaled ceases to be a documented event of 1462 and becomes a free-floating narrative motif. It is stripped of its context, the Ottoman military doctrine, the vassalage politics, the bureaucratic coldness, and repurposed. It feeds the emerging literary vampire myth centuries later, not because Vlad drank blood, but because his historical act represented a form of institutional life and death, a systematized draining of meaning from the human body. The methodical, archival horror is replaced by a supernatural, Gothic one. The cold institutional fact becomes a hot folk tale. The echo, therefore, is not one of continued tactical imitation. No later military commander successfully replicated the Târgoviște system as a strategy. Its power was singular and non-transferable. The echo is instead epistemological. The event stands as a stark boundary marker in the history of warfare and state terror. It demonstrates the moment a penal system is detached from any goal of reform, deterrence, or even revenge, and is deployed purely as a language meant to communicate the utter nullification of the opponent's worldview. Modern investigations, armed with forensic archaeology and historiography, circle the site, but find only the silence the original system demanded. The ground yields no grand archaeological footprint. The scale of the timber and the decomposition of organic matter leave faint traces. The evidence resides primarily in the recoil of the Ottoman sources, in the propagandistic distortions of his enemies, and in the vast, empty space in his own country's records. There is no closure to this analysis, only a chilling recognition of the blueprint. The event at Târgoviște in 1462 was a complete, self-contained system of terror: conception, logistical implementation, psychological delivery, and final erasure. It was a dark star in the historical firmament, whose gravity we perceive only by the bent light of the records around it, and the long, chilling shadow of the myth it accidentally spawned. The institution that carried it outconsumed itself in the process, and all that remains is the echo of a system that declared, with geometric finality, that there are forms of power whose only purpose is to demonstrate that they exist beyond all existing frames of reference.